Welcome to the deep dive. If you're joining us today, you're probably someone who, looks at the world and wonders, how did we get here?
Right.
Why do we think the way we do? And how can I actually navigate this increasingly complex reality? Because we've all had those moments of just pure existential vertigo.
Oh, totally.
So today we're embarking on this really expansive exploration of some of the most foundational ideas that have ever shaped human thought. We're looking at the bedrock of how we perceive reality, how we organize our societies, and really how we find meaning in our everyday lives.
Yeah, and the source material for this exploration is this brilliant set of translated excerpts from Matthias Leboeuf's book. It's called History of Philosophy in 32 Quotes.
Which is such a great concept.
It's a remarkable text, primarily because of what it actually attempts to do. Our mission today is quite specific. We are aiming to essentially rescue philosophy from that dense, impenetrable academic jargon it so often hides behind.
Yeah, the stuff that makes people's eyes glaze over.
Exactly. The goal here is to show you that philosophy isn't some dusty relic confined to, university libraries. It's a highly practical toolkit.
Right.
It's a toolkit for living, for making difficult decisions, and for understanding the completely chaotic world you navigate every single day. But engaging with it requires a certain degree of self-knowledge. It represents what we might call an epistemological rupture.
An epistemological rupture.
Yeah, which sounds intense, but it's really just the challenging, sometimes painful, but incredibly rewarding process of breaking away from simply accepting the world exactly as it appears to be.
Okay, let's unpack this, because Leboeuf's book uses these incredibly famous, sometimes almost cliché philosophical quotes.
Yeah.
But he doesn't use them as the final word on a subject. He uses them as entry doors.
Right, they're keys.
They're keys meant to unlock massive world-altering concepts. So we aren't just going to repeat these quotes and give you a trivia lesson. We are going to walk through the doors they open and really wrestle with what is on the other side.
And that first door takes us way, way back.
Right back to the very birth of questioning. We're looking at a time in the ancient Greek colonies, over in Asia Minor and southern Italy. This is long before Athens became the glittering center of the ancient world.
Yeah, completely different era.
At this point, the world was explained entirely by poets and priests through mythology. If a storm rolled in, it wasn't, a meteorological event. It was because a god was throwing a temper tantrum.
And this is a crucial starting point because it marks the monumental shift from mythos, which is myth, to logos.
Logos.
Right, logos, meaning reason or a rational underlying principle. The earliest thinkers, often called the pre-Socratics, they started looking for natural explanations or physis for the way the universe actually worked.
They weren't just taking the priest's word for it anymore.
Exactly. They were mathematicians, astronomers, and early physicists trying to identify the fundamental substance of the cosmos. Some thought it was water, others thought it was this infinite, boundless principle. But the figure who really shatters the mold here is Heraclitus.
Heraclitus.
Yeah, Heraclitus looked at the universe, and he chose fire as his primary principle.
Fire. Which, it instantly makes sense when you think about his most famous quote. Or at least the version of it that everyone prints on, coffee mugs.
Right, the river quote.
Yeah, you cannot step into the same river twice.
Mm.
Now, Leboeuf's text clarifies that a much better or rigorous translation of the Greek is actually different waters flow over those who step into the same rivers.
And what's fascinating here is the profound metaphysical view that this specific translation represents. Heraclitus is the ultimate philosopher of change, of endless becoming.
Yeah.
When he says different waters flow over those who step into the same rivers, he's making an ontological statement that flips our entire understanding of reality upside down. He's arguing that change is the only constant in the universe.
Right.
Think about a river. The identity of that river is actually formed by its very discontinuity. It only remains a river exactly because the water within it is constantly fleeing, constantly changing.
If the water stopped flowing, it wouldn't be a river.
Exactly. It would just become a stagnant lake.
That is a deeply unsettling thought, if you really sit with it. It means that identity actually requires change. It means that you, the person listening to this deep dive right now, you are not the exact same person you were when you hit play.
You literally aren't.
Your cells are metabolizing, your synaptic connections are shifting based on the very words you're hearing, your mood is altering. You are a process, not a static object.
Precisely. And Heraclitus took this even further. He argued that tension and opposites are what create cosmic harmony.
Tension.
Yeah, life and death, awake and asleep, young and old. These aren't just separate, isolated categories. They are fundamentally united because they are constantly transforming into one another. It's a dialectic struggle.
Which brings us to another of his famous quotes, one that sounds incredibly harsh at first glance.
Oh, I know the one.
War is the father of all.
See, I have to push back on that one because it sounds like a justification for endless violence. Is he just like an ancient warmonger trying to give a philosophical pass to kings who want to slaughter each other? It's a very common misinterpretation. But no, he isn't talking about human armies clashing on a battlefield for territory. He's talking about that dialectic struggle of opposites we just mentioned.
Okay.
The tension between opposing forces is the engine of reality. It's what creates balance. Think of a strung bow or a musical lyre.
A lyre, like the harp.
Exactly. The instrument only works, it only creates beautiful music or shoots a straight arrow because the wood and the string are pulling violently against each other in opposite directions.
The string wants to snap back, the wood wants to stay straight.
Right, and that tension is the harmony. Without the war between the string and the wood, you just have a useless stick and a piece of limp thread.
So the struggle is the point.
Mm-hmm.
But it's worth noting, based on the text, that Heraclitus was not an easy guy to be around.
No, not at all.
He was a wealthy aristocrat who essentially abandoned his hereditary political titles because he absolutely despised the general public. He was arrogant, he completely isolated himself, and his contemporaries literally called him the obscure.
Because of how he wrote.
Yeah, he wrote in these dense circular paradoxes. He felt he was channeling the logos itself. And if the average person couldn't understand his riddles, he thought that was entirely their fault.
He had a very low opinion of the masses. He famously said that most people prefer mud to clean water.
Wow.
Yeah, essentially comparing his critics to livestock. He was looking outward, deep into the physics of the cosmos and the tension of reality, and he just didn't have much patience for the mundane concerns of human society.
But eventually, looking at the stars and contemplating the infinite fire of the cosmos isn't enough to help a society function. You know, the focus of philosophy had to shift dramatically.
It had to come back to Earth.
Exactly. And this shift takes us from the architecture of the universe to turning the lens sharply inward. We arrive at Socrates. The text describes him as the first true individual of Western thought. And yet, this foundational pillar of Western philosophy wrote absolutely nothing down.
It's one of the most compelling paradoxes in the history of thought. Everything we know about Socrates comes secondhand.
Through his students.
Right. We rely on the writings of his brilliant students, primarily Plato and Xenophon, and we also see a very different, highly mocking version of him in a play by the comic poet Aristophanes.
The clouds. Right.
Yes, exactly. Now, physically, Socrates was notoriously ugly, which was a huge deal in a society that idealized physical symmetry and beauty as a direct reflection of inner moral virtue.
If you're beautiful outside, you're good inside.
That was the Greek mindset. But there was something mesmerizing about him. The text mentions that Alcibiades, who was this famous, beautiful, and highly ambitious Athenian general, compared Socrates to a Silenus doll.
A Silenus doll.
Yeah, these were cheap, grotesque-looking clay dolls sold in the local markets. But if you cracked them open, they contained a beautiful golden figurine of a god hidden inside.
That's a profound image.
That was Socrates. Rough, poor, and ugly on the outside, but containing this radiant, divine wisdom within.
And his operating system, his entire approach to the world, can be summed up in his two most famous catchphrases. Know thyself, and all I know is that I know nothing.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Socrates executed a massive, permanent pivot in human history. While Heraclitus was trying to define the physics of reality, Socrates brought philosophy down from the clouds and planted it firmly in the city streets.
He brought it to the people.
He shifted the entire discipline to focus on human ethics, virtue, and the state of the soul. And the defining turning point in his life came when a friend of his went to the Oracle of Delphi and asked the priestess if there was anyone on earth wiser than Socrates.
And the oracle, who supposedly spoke for the god Apollo, gave a definitive answer. No, there was no one wiser.
Right.
Which, if you understand Socrates, completely short-circuited his brain, because his entire philosophy was built on the premise that he was ignorant. So he doesn't just accept the compliment.
He treats it as a puzzle.
He treats it as a puzzle to be solved. He sets out on this relentless mission, wandering the streets of Athens, interrogating every powerful politician, every celebrated poet, and every master artisan to prove the oracle wrong. He's actively trying to find someone wiser than him.
And in doing so, he systematically dismantled the egos of the most powerful people in his society.
It must have been glorious to watch.
He engaged the politicians and discovered that while they spoke beautifully about justice, they actually had no idea what true justice was. They were just chasing power. He questioned the great poets and found that while they wrote moving verses through a kind of divine inspiration, they couldn't rationally explain the moral meaning of their own work.
And the artisans.
He talked to the artisans who were brilliant at building ships or forging armor, but because they possessed technical mastery in one specific area, they mistakenly believed they were also wise in matters of statecraft and the soul.
So it's basically the ancient equivalent of the Dunning-Kruger effect.
Exactly.
Everyone is walking around completely overestimating their own competence.
Exactly. And through this process, Socrates finally realized what the oracle actually meant. He was the wisest man in Athens precisely because he alone was aware of his own ignorance. He knew that he knew nothing, whereas everyone else was blinded by their false, unexamined confidence.
So when he says, know thyself, we have to be really careful not to project our modern therapy culture onto him.
Yes, that's a crucial distinction.
He wasn't telling people to go on a retreat and figure out their attachment style or their personality type. He meant something much more severe. He meant engaging in a ruthless ontological inquiry into our own limits. It's about stripping away the illusions we hold about our own expertise and recognizing the fragile, limited human condition.
He saw himself as the gadfly of Athens. A gadfly is a biting fly that stings a massive sluggish horse to wake it up.
Athens was the horse.
Yes. He viewed the city as this powerful, complacent beast, bloated on its own wealth and imperial power, and he was the insect stinging it into self-awareness. He accomplished this through a method he called meutics.
Which translates to midwifery. And his mother was actually a midwife, right?
Yes, and he claimed to practice the exact same art, but for the human mind. A midwife doesn't give birth to the child. She assists the mother. Socrates claimed he didn't possess any truth to hand over to his listeners. Instead, through relentless, rigorous questioning, the Socratic method or dialectic, he helped his conversation partners give birth to the internal truths they already carried within their souls but hadn't yet realized.
I can imagine how infuriating that would be. Nobody likes being backed into a logical corner in public by a guy claiming he's just a humble idiot asking questions.
It made him a lot of enemies.
And eventually, the city had enough. They put him on trial, charging him with corrupting the youth and inventing new gods. And they sentenced him to death by drinking hemlock. But even his execution becomes a masterclass in his philosophy.
It really does.
He's surrounded by his weeping students. The poison is literally freezing his legs, moving up toward his heart, and his final words are just so layered. He turns to his friend and says, "We owe a rooster to Asclepius. Please don't forget to pay the debt."
It is a stunning final statement. Asclepius is the god of medicine and healing. In ancient Greek culture, you sacrificed a rooster to him when you had just been cured of a terrible, life-threatening sickness.
Right, so by saying that as he dies, Socrates is implying that life itself, being trapped in this flawed physical body with all its messy desires and illusions, is the actual sickness. And death isn't a tragedy. Death is the ultimate cure that releases the soul.
It's a devastating critique of the physical world.
It's beautiful, but yeah, it's brutal.
He remained flawlessly true to his principles to his very last breath. He had opportunities to escape prison. His wealthy friends tried to bribe the guards, but he refused. He preferred to suffer an unjust death under the laws of his beloved city rather than compromise his philosophical mission or act out of fear.
So if Socrates just asked questions and left behind this massive legacy of relentless inquiry, he didn't leave a blueprint. He didn't leave a system. That monumental task fell to a young man who watched his beloved teacher drink poison, and it completely altered the trajectory of his life. We're talking about Plato.
Plato was an aristocrat, born into one of the most prominent families in Athens. He was destined for a brilliant career in politics.
But the trial changed everything.
Yes, the unjust, democratic execution of Socrates deeply traumatized him. It utterly disgusted him with Athenian politics and turned him entirely toward philosophy. Plato became the architect of the first massive, comprehensive philosophical system in the Western world. And the absolute cornerstone of that system is the theory of the idea, or the forms.
Okay, the realm of ideas. Let's really dig into this because it shapes almost everything that comes after it. Plato essentially argues that this physical world we live in, the microphone I'm speaking into, the chair you're sitting on, the trees outside, this is all flawed, decaying, and ultimately not the true reality.
It's a cheap copy.
Right, the true reality exists in a transcendent, eternal, perfect realm of ideas.
Yeah.
And to explain this wild concept, he gives us arguably the most famous metaphor in human history, the allegory of the cave. Proof quotes it simply as, "We are stuck in a hole underground thinking we are on the surface."
To really grasp the gravity of Plato's thought, we need to truly visualize this allegory. Imagine a deep, cavernous underground space. Deep inside, there are prisoners who have been shackled to a wall since the very moment they were born.
Shackled so tightly they can't even turn their heads.
Exactly. They cannot move their bodies. They can only stare straight ahead at the blank rock face in front of them. Now, far behind them, higher up near the entrance of the cave, a massive fire is burning. And between that fire and the chained prisoners, there is a raised walkway.
Like a stage.
Yes, and people walk along this path carrying various objects, statues of animals, carved trees, geometric shapes. The light from the fire casts the shadows of these objects onto the wall right in front of the prisoners.
And because these prisoners have been chained there since birth, they have absolutely no concept of the outside world or the fire or the statues. All they have ever seen, all they have ever known are those two-dimensional, flickering black shadows.
It is their entire universe.
So naturally, they believe the shadows are the absolute totality of reality. They give the shadows names, they debate the movements of the shadows, they build their entire culture and worldview around this illusion.
Exactly. Then Plato says, imagine one of these prisoners is suddenly freed. Not gently awakened, but violently dragged up the steep, jagged path toward the entrance of the cave. When he finally reaches the surface, the brilliant sunlight completely blinds him.
The pain must be unbearable.
The transition is agonizing. His eyes, accustomed only to the dark, cannot process the light at all. It takes time. First, he can only look at the shadows on the ground outside. Then maybe the reflections of trees in a pool of water. Then the physical trees themselves. Finally, his eyes adjust enough that he can look up and see the sun itself.
And the sun represents something very specific for Plato.
Yes, for Plato, the sun is the symbol for the idea of the good, the ultimate, illuminating, eternal truth that gives life and meaning to everything else in the universe.
It's a profound awakening. And looking at this from a modern perspective, Plato's cave feels more relevant now than it did in ancient Athens.
Oh, absolutely.
Think about how we live today. We literally sit in dark rooms, staring at glowing rectangles. We look at social media feeds completely manipulated by hidden algorithms. We watch carefully edited news segments. We consume targeted advertisements. We are constantly looking at the shadows of reality projected by invisible creators, and we treat it as absolute truth. Plato's cave is this screaming warning across millennia about the danger of accepting mediated sensory information as the real world.
What's fascinating here is that Plato doesn't end the story with the freed prisoner simply enjoying the beautiful sunshine of eternal truth.
Right, he doesn't get to just stay up there.
No, the philosopher realizes he has a moral, inescapable duty. He must go back down into the dark, miserable cave to tell his friends the truth, to unchain them and lead them to the light.
But when he goes back down, it's a disaster. His eyes are now adjusted to the brilliant sunlight, so in the darkness of the cave, he is practically blind. He stumbles around, he can't recognize the old shadows, he can't play their guessing games anymore.
He looks like an idiot to them.
Exactly. The other prisoners look at him and conclude that leaving the cave completely ruined him. He's lost his mind.
And Plato explicitly states that if this freed prisoner tries to physically unchain them and force them toward the agonizing light of truth, they will violently resist. They will band together and kill him.
Which is just a...
This is, without a doubt, Plato processing the trauma of what democratic Athens did to Socrates.
Right. Athens was the cave, the citizens were the prisoners entranced by the shadows of politics and wealth, and Socrates was the man who came back to free them. So they killed him.
It shaped his entire worldview.
And this trauma entirely dictates Plato's political philosophy. He develops this intense, lifelong distrust of democracy. He views it as a chaotic system where ignorant prisoners just compete to see who can guess the shadow movements best, regardless of actual merit or wisdom.
It's a popularity contest for shadows.
So he designs a selective, highly authoritarian doctrine. He argues that society should only be ruled by those very few individuals who have successfully made the painful journey out of the cave and seen the sun, the philosopher kings.
Plato's vision is magnificent in its idealism, but it is incredibly rigid. He wants to banish the poets, heavily regulate education, and enforce a strict hierarchy based on intellectual capacity. It is a brilliant system, but it is highly abstract and deeply suspicious of the messy, biological reality of human desires.
He really wanted to control the variables.
He did, and this highly theoretical approach to the good did not sit well with the man who was arguably Plato's greatest student.
Which brings us to Aristotle. Now, Aristotle is a totally different personality. He wasn't a native Athenian aristocrat. He was from Stagira in the north, making him a metic, a resident foreigner in Athens.
He had an outsider's perspective.
He famously left the city for a while to tutor a young Macedonian prince, who would eventually grow up to be Alexander the Great. When he returned to Athens, he didn't rejoin Plato's academy. He founded his own school, the Lyceum. They were nicknamed the Peripatetics because Aristotle couldn't stand still. He loved to walk around the covered colonnades of the school while he was lecturing.
A very active thinker.
And the quote LeBouf highlights for Aristotle is beautifully simple. One swallow does not make a spring.
That phrase perfectly encapsulates Aristotle's incredibly grounded, empirical approach to philosophy. He fundamentally rejects Plato's concept of single, abstract, universal idea of the good floating in some disconnected metaphysical realm.
He brings it back down.
Aristotle is a biologist at heart. He looks at the physical world. For him, the good is not a transcendent form you study through pure mathematics. It is relative, situational, and highly practical.
Okay, give me an example.
Well, the good for a critically ill person is medicine and health. The good for a starving person is a meal. The good for a master archer is hitting the bullseye. He brings the concept of the good crashing back down to earth.
He builds this around a concept he called entelechy, which is basically the journey from potential to actuality. An acorn has the potential to be a massive oak tree, but it only achieves its actuality if it gets water, soil, and time to grow.
It needs the right conditions.
Right. So the obvious question becomes, what is the actuality of a human being? What is our ultimate goal? Aristotle says it is happiness, or eudaimonia. But we need to be really careful with that word, because modern culture has completely bastardized the concept of happiness.
You really have.
We treat it like a fleeting emotion, like the rush you get when you buy something new or have a few drinks on a Friday night.
That is a crucial distinction. For Aristotle, eudaimonia is absolutely not a mood. You cannot feel eudaimonia for an hour and then lose it. Eudaimonia is an activity.
An activity.
Specifically, it is an activity of the soul in accordance with virtue over the course of a complete life. And how do we find virtue? Aristotle argues that virtue is almost always found as a peak, a delicate balance between two extreme unhealthy states. This is the famous golden mean.
So it's not about just following a rigid list of rules. It's about calibrating your behavior based on the specific situation.
Precisely. Let's take courage, for example. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the virtuous peak between the deficiency of cowardice on one side and the excess of foolish recklessness on the other.
So running into a burning building for no reason isn't courage, it's recklessness.
Right. And generosity is the mean between being a stingy miser and being wildly, wastefully extravagant with your resources. And you don't become virtuous by sitting in a cave and contemplating the abstract idea of courage. You become courageous by consistently performing courageous acts in the real world until they become deeply ingrained habits.
It's like working out.
Yes, virtue is a muscle you have to build through action.
And here's where Aristotle's brutal realism really shines through. Unlike some philosophers who claim that a truly wise person can be perfectly happy even while being tortured on a rack, Aristotle says, look, let's be intellectually honest here.
Right.
You cannot easily achieve eudaimonia if you're born into absolute poverty, or if you're hideously ugly and ostracized, or if you lose all your children in a plague.
He's not sugarcoating it.
He acknowledges the terrifying role of luck and external circumstances in our lives.
He is incredibly pragmatic. He says that complete self-sufficiency, a state where you need absolutely nothing from the outside world, is only possible for a wild beast or a god. But human beings are inherently political animals. We are social creatures down to our very biology.
We need each other.
We need the community, the polis, to achieve our highest potential. We need deep friendships. We need a functional, just society to provide the framework within which we can actually practice virtue.
And this brings us back to the quote, one swallow does not make a spring. Just as seeing one bird in the sky or having one unusually warm day in February doesn't mean winter is over, performing one generous act or having one really good day does not mean you have achieved eudaimonia.
It takes time.
True human flourishing requires immense patience. It is the culmination of a lifetime of consistent, virtuous work within a community.
However, the era of the independent, tight-knit Greek city-state, the very polis that Aristotle relied on as the necessary container for human happiness, was about to violently collapse.
Oh, right, Alexander the Great.
Yes. Aristotle's own pupil, Alexander the Great, marched his armies across the globe, forging massive empires. And in the wake of these colossal shifting empires, the old, intimate communal structures broke down. The individual citizens suddenly felt tiny, disconnected, and overwhelmed by a chaotic world they could no longer influence.
Right. If your entire philosophy is built on being an active, meaningful participant in your local community, what do you do when your community is swallowed by a faceless global empire?
You have to adapt.
This historical crisis gave rise to a totally new era of philosophy. If we can't control the world anymore, we have to control ourselves. It's essentially the birth of ancient self-help, and the first major figure to offer a prescription is Epicurus.
Epicurus lived from 341 to 270 BC, and he is one of the most misunderstood figures in history.
Seriously misunderstood.
He founded a school just outside Athens called the Garden. It was radically, almost dangerously progressive for its time because it explicitly welcomed everyone. Men, women, prostitutes, and slaves were all allowed to study philosophy together.
Which the elite hated.
Because of this, the traditional philosophical establishment hated him. They slandered him horribly. They spread vicious rumors that he was a glutton who forced himself to vomit twice a day just so he could keep gorging on food, and that he ran a brothel instead of a school.
Which is wild, because when you hear his most famous quote, "Pleasure is the beginning and end of a happy life," it's easy to see how people could twist that.
Yeah.
Even today, if you call a restaurant an Epicurean delight, you are implying that they serve $50 truffles, incredibly expensive wine, and luxurious, decadent food. But Epicurus would have hated that restaurant.
He would have run away from it.
Yeah.
It is a profound historical irony. Epicurus was a strict materialist, but his version of pleasure was the exact opposite of luxury.
Right.
For him, the absolute greatest pleasure a human being could possibly experience was a simple cup of cool water and a piece of plain barley bread when you were genuinely physically thirsty and hungry. True pleasure, he argued, is not about overindulgence or constantly seeking the next thrill. True pleasure is ataraxia.
Ataraxia. I love that word. It translates roughly to the complete absence of physical pain and mental disturbance. It's not a high. It's a profound, unshakable baseline of tranquility.
Exactly.
And to help people reach this state, Epicurus developed a psychological toolkit called the Tetrapharmakos, the 4-part cure. Let's break this down because it's incredibly practical. Part 1, don't fear the gods.
That's a big one.
He argued that if the gods exist, they exist in a state of absolute blissful perfection. And a perfect being doesn't experience anger or petty jealousy. They literally couldn't care less about what we are doing down here. So you don't need to live in terror that Zeus is going to hit you with a lightning bolt because you forgot a sacrifice.
The second part of the cure is perhaps his most brilliant psychological intervention, though it requires a massive perspective shift. Don't fear death.
Easier said than done.
Epicurus was an atomist. Following the theories of Democritus, he believed that the entire universe, including the human soul, is made entirely of tiny particles called atoms, moving through a void. When we are alive, our atoms are held together in a specific arrangement. When we die, those atoms simply lose their bond and disperse back into the universe to become other things.
So there is no underworld, no judgment, no eternal punishment.
Exactly. Therefore, he argued with cold logic, death is literally nothing to us. When we exist, death is not present. And when death arrives, we no longer exist to experience it.
We just aren't there.
You will never, ever have the conscious experience of being dead. So what exactly are you afraid of? Fearing a state that you will never consciously inhabit is a waste of your living energy.
I can hear the logic, but as a human being wired for survival, it's a very hard pill to swallow. The intellectual understanding that I'm just atoms doesn't entirely erase the existential dread of the void. But let's look at part 3 of the cure, which deals with life. Pain is endurable. He reasoned that if a physical pain is chronic and long-lasting like an aching joint, it's usually relatively mild, and human psychology is incredibly adaptable. You get used to it. On the other hand, if a pain is incredibly intense and sharp, it won't last long. It will either pass quickly or it will kill you, which brings us right back to rule 2. You disperse into atoms, so don't fear death.
And finally, part 4 of The Cure. Happiness is remarkably easy to attain, provided you understand how to categorize your desires. Epicurus noted that human anxiety stems from chasing the wrong things.
We want too much.
He split our desires into 3 groups. First, there are natural and necessary desires: food, water, basic shelter, and friendship. These are very easy to satisfy, and they bring deep contentment. Second, there are natural but unnecessary desires, like a gourmet meal instead of plain bread, or a beautifully crafted bed instead of a simple mat.
Nice to have, but not essential.
He said you can enjoy these if they happen to fall into your lap, but you must never become psychologically attached to them, because losing them will cause pain.
And the third category is the danger zone. Unnatural and unnecessary desires. The craving for immense wealth, political power, fame, or immortality. Epicurus warned that these desires are infinite black holes. Because they have no natural limit, you can never satisfy them.
They just keep growing.
If you get $1 million, you'll immediately want 10 million. If you get fame, you'll be terrified of losing relevance. Pursuing these unnatural desires is a guaranteed recipe for destroying your ataraxia.
It is a philosophy of radical pruning. You cut away the excessive desires, you withdraw from the chaotic ambitions of public life, and you cultivate a quiet garden of friendship and simple pleasures. But this idea of focusing only on what is strictly necessary leads us directly into another massive philosophical movement from this era.
Stoicism.
If Epicurus taught us how to curate our desires, Epictetus teaches us how to armor our minds against a world that will inevitably hurt us.
Section 4 of this era brings us to the giant of Stoicism, Epictetus. He lived from roughly 55 to 130 AD, and his personal background gives his philosophy an immense amount of gravity. He wasn't a wealthy aristocrat theorizing in a garden.
Far from it.
Epictetus was born a slave in the Roman Empire. He served under a notoriously cruel master named Epaphroditus. The historical anecdote is that his master, in a fit of rage, began twisting Epictetus's leg in a torture device. Epictetus didn't scream or beg. He calmly looked at his master and said, "If you keep turning that, you are going to break my leg." The master kept turning, the bone snapped, and Epictetus simply said, "I told you it would break." He lived the rest of his life with a severe limp.
That story, whether literal history or slightly mythologized, perfectly encapsulates the absolute core of his teaching. Epictetus never wrote anything down. His brilliant lectures were transcribed by his student Arian into a manual called the Enchiridion.
The Enchiridion.
In Greek, Enchiridion means a handbook, but it was also the word for a small dagger, a weapon you keep close at hand at all times for immediate self-defense. That is how he viewed philosophy. It wasn't abstract theory. It was a weapon to defend your mind against the assaults of reality.
And the most important weapon in that arsenal is his foundational quote, "Some things are up to us, some are not." This is the famous Stoic dichotomy of control. For Epictetus, the entire secret to freedom and psychological survival lies in ruthlessly, constantly dividing the world into these two categories.
It's a binary system.
What is actually up to us? Only our internal world, our conscious judgments, our voluntary impulses, our desires, and our aversions. That's it.
And what is not up to us? Literally everything else in the universe. Our physical bodies can get sick or be injured. Our wealth can be stolen or lost in a market crash. Our reputation is entirely in the minds of other people who are fickle and irrational. And political power is wielded by others.
We control none of that.
Epictetus argues that all human misery stems from a single fundamental error. We attach our happiness to things that are not up to us. When we demand that the external world conform to our wishes, we are guaranteeing our own enslavement to fortune.
But I have to play devil's advocate here, because the way Epictetus applies this can sound terrifyingly cold, almost sociopathic to modern ears. He prescribes these intense mental training exercises. He says, if you have a favorite clay pot, you shouldn't walk around thinking, "I love this eternal, perfect pot." You must actively remind yourself, "I love a pot, which is made of fragile clay." So when it inevitably gets knocked off the table and shatters, your mind isn't destroyed by the loss.
That seems reasonable enough for a piece of pottery.
Right, but then he scales it up to human beings. He says, when you kiss your child or your spouse goodnight, you must actively tell yourself that you are kissing a mortal being. If they die in the night, you shouldn't cry out, "I have lost them." You should say, "They have been returned." Honestly, if I walk around treating my family like they're library books on loan from the universe, doesn't that completely rob human relationships of their actual depth and love? Isn't this just a recipe for emotional numbness?
It is a profoundly challenging concept, and it is the most common critique of Stoicism. But we have to look deeper at what Epictetus is actually trying to achieve. He is not advocating for emotional numbness or a lack of love. Quite the opposite.
Really? How so?
By recognizing the fragility and impermanence of your loved ones, you are actually forced to love them more fiercely and presently while you have them because you know they can be taken at any moment.
So it's about defeating the illusion of permanence.
Yeah, exactly. Epictetus is demanding radical responsibility over the one single thing you actually control, your own judgment. He famously stated, "It is not things that upset people, but their judgments about things." Let's say you lose your job.
Okay, lost my job.
The loss of the job is an objective, external event in the universe. It is not up to you, but the narrative in your head, the thought that says, this is a catastrophic disaster, my life is ruined, I am a failure, that is a judgment. And that judgment is entirely up to you. You are choosing to add suffering to the objective reality.
It's about aligning your mind with the logos, the natural unfolding flow of the universe. If you try to swim upstream against the universe, you will drown in anxiety. But if you accept the universe exactly as it unfolds and only focus on how virtuously you respond to it, you become philosophically invincible. An emperor can throw you in chains, but he cannot make you feel degraded unless you give him your consent.
Precisely. This relentless desire to cut away the unnecessary, to stop attaching ourselves to things beyond our control, actually builds a fascinating bridge to our next major historical leap.
We're jumping ahead.
We are going to move forward roughly 1,000 years, out of antiquity and into the Middle Ages, to meet a monk who armed himself with a very different kind of philosophical weapon.
We're talking about William of Ockham, who lived from 1285 to 1347. He was a deeply devout Franciscan theologian. He was brilliant, uncompromising, and deeply involved in what was arguably the most intense intellectual battle of the entire Middle Ages, the Universals debate. He earned a nickname that sounds like a Marvel superhero, the Invincible Doctor.
The Universals debate can sound incredibly dry and abstract at first, but we have to understand that the stakes were incredibly high. It was a battle over the very nature of reality and God. You essentially had two camps. On one side were the realists, who were heavily influenced by Plato.
The realm of ideas again.
Exactly. They believed the abstract concepts, which they called universals, had a real physical existence in some higher divine realm. So qualities like humanity, redness, or justice were real things created by God.
And on the other side, you had the nominalists, led by Occam. And Occam looks at this Platonic setup and says, this is ridiculous. He argues that these abstract concepts are just nomina, words. They are just linguistic tools that our brains invent to categorize individual concrete things. There is no eternal floating form of horseness in the sky. There are just millions of individual physical horses trotting around the earth, and we use the word horse to group them together for convenience.
And out of this debate comes his legendary concept, Occam's razor. Now, as a point of historical accuracy, he never actually wrote down the exact Latin phrase that people attribute to him today.
Entia non sunt multiplicanda praeter necessitatem.
Right, but the underlying principle is entirely his. Leboeuf translates the core concept as, we should not multiply things unnecessarily.
The principle of parsimony. It's essentially the ultimate tool for intellectual economy. Occam is telling us to keep our explanations as simple as humanly possible. If you're trying to explain why a rock falls to the ground, and you can explain it using physical laws and two moving parts, why on earth would you invent a massive, complex theory that requires invisible metaphysical strings and 10 moving parts? Use the razor to shave away all the unnecessary metaphysical clutter.
And Occam used this razor to do something incredibly radical and highly dangerous for a 14th century monk. He used it to sever the tie between faith and reason.
That's huge.
For centuries, theologians had tried to use complex Aristotelian logic to mathematically prove the existence of God or the immortality of the soul or the mystery of the Holy Trinity. Occam took his razor to all of it. He argued that reason and empirical observation are tools meant only for the physical world. They belong to science. Faith, on the other hand, belongs entirely to theology. You cannot logically prove the Trinity, you just have to believe it through faith.
By drawing this incredibly sharp line, he basically told the church to stop trying to micromanage physics. He unintentionally freed early science from the suffocating, dogmatic grip of theology. It made him a massive precursor to the modern scientific method. But unsurprisingly, telling the Pope that theology has no place in understanding the physical world didn't go over well.
It got him excommunicated. He had to flee for his life and seek protection under the Holy Roman Emperor. But the intellectual damage was done. His razor had successfully cleared the brush of medieval scholasticism.
But once you clear away the old cluttered foundation, you are left with a terrifying question.
No.
What do we build on now? How can we know anything for
We can
certain?
get a new foundation.
Exactly. To answer that, we needed a new architect. And that architect was René Descartes. He lived from 1596 to 1650. Looking at Leboeuf's notes on his life, I was struck by how different his biography is from the medieval monks who came before him. He wasn't locked in a cloistered university debating scripture. He was a mercenary soldier who fought in wars, a traveler, and a brilliant mathematician.
He invented the Cartesian coordinate system.
The X and Y axes that tortured us all in high school geometry. He was looking for a mathesis universalis, a universal science that could link all human knowledge together.
Descartes envisioned all of human knowledge as a massive tree. The applied sciences, medicine, mechanics, ethics are the branches that bear the actual fruit that helps humanity. The trunk holding them up is physics, but the hidden roots that nourish the entire structure, that is metaphysics.
The unseen foundation.
Descartes realized that if the root system was rotten, the whole tree of science would collapse. To build this universal science, he needed an absolutely solid, indestructible root system. He needed a single truth that was completely immune to doubt. And this quest leads us to what is easily the most famous quote in the history of philosophy: "I think, therefore I am." Or, in Latin, cogito ergo sum.
To understand the sheer power of this quote, we have to walk through the terrifying psychological method he used to arrive at it. He didn't just sit in a chair, stroke his chin, and declare it. He engaged in a terrifying process called radical hyperbolic doubt.
Hyperbolic doubt.
Yeah. He decided to treat any belief that held even a fraction of a percent of doubt as entirely false. He wanted to systematically demolish his entire worldview to see if anything was left standing in the rubble.
He begins by throwing out everything he learned from books and teachers. After all, history is full of brilliant people who turned out to be completely wrong. Then he turns to his own empirical senses. We rely on our eyes and ears, but Descartes notes that our senses deceive us all the time.
Like mirages.
Exactly. A straight stick looks bent when you put it in a glass of water. A square tower looks round from a distance. If your senses can lie to you once, how can you trust them as the absolute foundation of reality?
He keeps going deeper. He looks at his own physical body. He says, right now, I feel like I'm sitting by the fire in my dressing gown, but how many times have I had a vivid dream where I felt exactly like this, only to wake up in bed? There is no definitive, foolproof test to prove that you are not dreaming right now.
Yeah.
So out goes the physical body and the external world.
But he doesn't stop there. He pushes the doubt to its absolute horrifying extreme with the evil demon thought experiment.
This one messes with my head.
What if, he asks, the universe was not created by a loving, truthful God, but by a supremely powerful, malevolent demon whose entire existence is dedicated to deceiving Descartes? This demon could be manipulating his mind so completely that even basic mathematics is a lie.
Like changing the rules of math.
Yes. Maybe a square doesn't really have 4 sides. Maybe 2 plus 2 actually equals 5. But the demon simply rewires Descartes' brain to feel a false sense of certainty every time he does the math.
If you really let yourself sit in that thought experiment, it is pure existential vertigo. If a demon is tricking me about the physical world, my memories, and even basic math, is there literally anything left? Am I just a hallucination? But right at the bottom of this abyss of doubt, Descartes finds the bedrock.
The one thing he can't doubt.
He realizes that even if he is being deceived about absolutely everything, there must be an I that is being deceived. The demon has to have a target. The very act of doubting his own existence is proof of his existence. He cannot doubt that he is doubting. Therefore, I think, therefore I am.
The magnitude of this realization cannot be overstated. This is the pivot point of the modern world. Before Descartes, human beings searched for truth by looking outward. At the cosmos, at the authority of God, or in ancient texts, Descartes completely shifts the anchor of reality.
It's all internal now.
This subject, the individual, isolated, conscious mind, becomes the center of the universe. The only undeniable foundation of reality is human consciousness. From that single, unbreakable point, Descartes works backward to logically reconstruct the existence of God and the physical world. But the revolution was irreversible. The individual human mind was now the supreme judge of truth.
It is a brilliant, airtight fortress of logic. But not everyone in this era was obsessed with finding absolute mathematical certainty. While Descartes was building his indestructible fortress of the mind, another thinker was looking at the human experience and saying, why are we pretending this is so neat and orderly?
Exactly.
This brings us to Michel de Montaigne, who lived from 1533 to 1592. Montaigne didn't come to philosophy through a desire to master physics. He came to it through profound, shattering grief.
Montaigne experienced the agonizing death of his absolute best friend, Etienne de la Boétie. The loss devastated him so deeply that in 1571, he essentially resigned from his political duties, retired to his family estate, and locked himself in a tower surrounded by a massive library of classical books.
He just withdrew completely.
He inscribed a dedication on the wall to his lost friend and began to write. And in that tower, he invented an entirely new genre of literature, the essay. The word itself is vital. It comes from the French verb essayer, which means to try or to attempt.
It perfectly captures his entire vibe. While Descartes wanted absolute certainty, Montaigne fully embraced the messiness, the uncertainty, and the profound fluidity of just being a human being. His personal motto, which he had struck on a medallion, was, "What do I know?"
A very humble approach.
He viewed life not as a rigid mathematical equation to be solved, but as a constant shifting seesaw. Leboeuf highlights a brilliant defining quote from Montaigne. "I prefer to forge my soul rather than furnish it."
That distinction between forging and furnishing is beautiful. He doesn't want a full head, a mind passively stuffed with facts, trivia, and other people's dogmatic opinions like a piece of overstuffed furniture. He wants a well-made head, an active, dynamic mind that is constantly questioning, constantly exploring, and forging its own unique character through experience.
And his writing style completely reflects this beautifully chaotic approach. If you read Montaigne, it is not a structured philosophical treatise, it's wild. He bounces around from writing a profound meditation on the nature of friendship, to a sociological essay on cannibalism in the New World, to a strange tangent about the physical shape of human thumbs.
Or his kidney stones.
Yes, highly detailed descriptions of his painful kidney stones. He just followed his curiosity wherever it led him that day.
Some critics at the time found it incredibly narcissistic. Why was this nobleman writing hundreds of pages about his own bodily functions and shifting moods? But Montaigne wasn't writing out of ego. He wrote about himself so intensely because he firmly believed a profound truth. Every single person contains the entire human condition within them. By looking deeply and honestly at his own specific, flawed, constantly changing self, he believed he was uncovering universal truths about what it means to be human.
Montaigne's retreat into his own mind and his library tower is fascinating. But let's be honest, it was a luxury. It was a luxury afforded by his wealth and his physical isolation. But what happens when we can't hide in a tower? What happens when we are forced out into the muddy, brutal reality of organizing millions of flawed, emotional human beings into a functioning state?
That's where it gets messy.
That harsh reality forces us to pivot from the inner sanctuary of the mind to the blood-soaked world of political philosophy.
We are entering the realm of statecraft, power, and societal design. And we must begin with the ultimate realist, Niccolò Machiavelli. Machiavelli lived from 1469 to 1527. He was a high-ranking official and diplomat in the Republic of Florence. He was intimately involved in the gritty, day-to-day realities of military affairs and international negotiation.
He was in the room where it happens.
But politics in Renaissance Italy was a deadly game. When the powerful, autocratic Medici family returned to power in Florence, Machiavelli was caught on the wrong side. He was suspected of conspiracy, imprisoned, physically tortured, and finally exiled to a small country estate.
And it was out there in exile, staring at the walls, and desperate to win back the favor of the Medici so he could return to the political arena, that he wrote his infamous, tiny guidebook for rulers, The Prince. And in writing this book, he completely broke the mold of centuries of classical and Christian political philosophy.
He tore it up.
Before Machiavelli, if you wrote a book about politics, it was all about moral ideals. It was about how a leader should behave. The prince should be pious, he should be merciful, he should be strictly honest. Machiavelli looks at the chaos of Italy, the constant invasions and betrayals, and essentially says, forget about how things should be in heaven, let's look at how things actually work in the dirt. Which leads to his most famous and frankly terrifying quote, "It is safer to be feared than loved."
To understand why he makes such a dark calculation, we have to grasp two opposing forces that dominate Machiavelli's worldview, fortuna and virtue. Fortuna is luck, circumstance, the unpredictable, chaotic nature of history. He famously compared Fortuna to a raging, destructive river that constantly threatens to flood its banks, destroy crops, and wash away entire cities.
So Fortuna is the storm.
Yes. Virtue, and we must be very careful not to confuse this with Christian moral virtue, is the strength, the adaptability, the ruthless will, and the cunning required to build dams, dig canals, and divert that raging river. A successful leader must possess immense virtue to conquer and control Fortuna.
And the brutal truth he exposes is that sometimes deploying virtue to save the state means you absolutely cannot be a good person in the traditional moral sense. Machiavelli explicitly states that a leader must learn how not to be good when the survival of the republic is at stake. He uses a brilliant animal metaphor, the lion and the fox.
The lion and the fox.
The prince must be a lion capable of terrifying force to frighten off the wolves, but raw force isn't enough. He must also be a fox, capable of extreme cunning and deception to recognize and evade traps.
He is a master of political psychology. He advises that if a leader must use cruelty, if they must execute rivals or suppress a rebellion, that cruelty should be applied strategically and all at once. It should be swift and absolute so that the terror is established immediately and the populace can begin to recover and move on.
Hit it over with.
Exactly. Conversely, he advises that benefits, tax cuts, or favors should be handed out very slowly, drop by drop, so the public is constantly feeling grateful.
I always try to put myself in the shoes of someone reading this for the first time. It feels like reading a manual for a sociopath. But he does put limits on it. He warns that a leader must carefully balance fear. Fear is a highly effective tool of control because you control the fear, whereas love depends on the fickle emotions of the people. However, a leader must absolutely avoid crossing the line into being truly hated.
Hatred is dangerous.
Hatred makes people irrational. It leads to violent rebellion. To avoid hatred, he gives one very specific, very cynical piece of advice. Never steal the property or the spouses of your subjects, because men will sooner forget the death of their father than the loss of their inheritance.
It is a dark, surgically pragmatic view of human nature. But at the exact same historical moment, across the English Channel, another politician facing a deeply corrupt system was taking a wildly different approach. This brings us to Thomas More, the dreamer. More lived from 1478 to 1535. He was an incredibly powerful figure, the Lord Chancellor of England, sitting at the right hand of King Henry VIII. He was eventually executed by Henry for sticking to his Catholic principles and refusing to acknowledge the king's break with the Pope. But years before his execution, he wrote a text that invented a brand new concept, utopia.
The word utopia itself is a brilliant, layered pun. Based on the Greek roots more used, it can be translated as autopos, meaning no place, but it sounds identical to utopias, meaning the good place. It is a place that is perfect, but does not actually exist.
Right.
And the book itself is fascinating because it's split into two distinct halves. Book one is not about a fantasy island. It is a searing, brutally realistic critique of early 16th century England. More attacks the massive wealth inequality, the draconian laws where starving peasants were hanged for stealing a loaf of bread, and the devastating practice of enclosures.
The enclosures were brutal.
Wealthy landlords were kicking peasant farmers off their ancestral lands to raise sheep because the international wool trade was more lucrative than growing food. Moore summarized this horror with the chilling phrase, "Sheep eat men."
Having diagnosed the terrible disease in Book 1, Moore presents the cure in Book 2, the detailed description of the island of Utopia, and it is a radical departure from European society. On Utopia, private property has been entirely abolished. Money does not exist. Everyone, regardless of status, works a mandatory 6-hour workday, primarily in agriculture, and then they are free to spend the rest of their time reading, attending lectures, or learning crafts. Furthermore, Utopia practices religious tolerance, an idea that was practically unthinkable in the violent religious wars of 1500s Europe.
It sounds like an idyllic socialist paradise, until you read the fine print. Utopia enforces incredibly strict, puritanical moral codes. There are no taverns, no private gatherings. Premarital sex is heavily punished, and adultery is punished by lifelong slavery, or, for a second offense, death.
It's extremely rigid.
Everyone wears the exact same undyed clothes, every house looks exactly the same, and citizens are randomly rotated into different houses every 10 years to prevent them from feeling any sense of private ownership. The pressure to conform is absolute. It honestly sounds exhausting.
It raises profound interpretive questions. Was More genuinely proposing a proto-communist blueprint for society? Was he expressing a pure form of Christian humanism? Or was the entire book a massive, ironic thought experiment designed simply to highlight the grotesque absurdities of European greed?
It's hard to pin him down.
LaBouffe pulls a quote from More that gives us insight into his personal philosophy of navigating corrupt power. The captain does not abandon his ship in a storm because he cannot control the winds.
I love that quote. It perfectly describes More's belief in the indirect route of political reform. He knew King Henry's court was corrupt and dangerous, but he believed that a moral person doesn't just scream uselessly at the storm and they don't abandon the ship to sink. You stay at your post. You compromise where you absolutely must. You whisper good advice when the king is listening, and you try to steer the ship just a few degrees away from the rocks, mitigating the disaster as best you can.
It is a noble, tragic philosophy, especially knowing that the storm he tried to navigate eventually ripped his head off. But the societal storm More was worried about in England did not dissipate. A century later, it erupted into the total bloodbath of the English Civil War.
It got so much worse.
The ship of state completely shattered. And amidst that terrifying chaos, another philosopher emerged to explain why humans destroy each other and how we can stop it. We arrive at Thomas Hobbes.
Hobbes lived from 1588 to 1679. He literally watched his society rip itself apart in civil war. Neighbors killing neighbors. The king beheaded in the street. This trauma permanently burned itself into his view of human nature. Unlike Aristotle, who thought we were naturally drawn to community, Hobbes viewed human beings almost like biological machines.
Just bodies in motion.
We're just physical bodies in constant motion, driven relentlessly by our appetites and our aversions. And he gives us one of the bleakest quotes in the book, "Man is a wolf to man."
To explain this terrifying premise, Hobbes asks us to conduct a thought experiment. He asks us to imagine humans in a state of nature. This is a hypothetical time before any governments, laws, police forces, or moral codes existed. In this state, Hobbes observes a dangerous truth. Human beings are all roughly equal in their physical and mental capacities.
Even the weak can kill the strong.
Yes, some are stronger, but even the weakest person can kill the strongest person if they use stealth or team up with others.
Right. And because we are roughly equal in ability, we all have an equal hope of satisfying our desires. But resources, food, shelter, mates, are scarce. So natural equality plus scarce resources inevitably leads to violent competition. It leads to paranoia, diffidence, and a desperate search for glory and dominance just to secure your own safety. It leads to what he famously called a war of all against all.
And in this state of nature, there's no industry, no culture, no art, no building, because the fruit of your labor will just be stolen by someone stronger tomorrow. Hobbes summarized existence in the state of nature with arguably the most famous bleak sentence in English literature. Human life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short.
I used to think of it like a zombie apocalypse movie, but that's the wrong analogy.
Yeah.
It's more like the geopolitical doctrine of mutually assured destruction during the Cold War. If there is no overarching authority to enforce the rules, every actor is forced to arm themselves and treat everyone else as a deadly threat just to survive. So how do we get out of this nightmare?
We make a deal.
Hobbes argues that human beings, driven by a desperate, rational fear of violent death, invent the social contract. They agree to completely surrender their chaotic natural right to do whatever they want, and they transfer that absolute power to a sovereign authority.
And that sovereign authority is the Leviathan. This is the title of his masterwork, and the visual imagery he chose for the cover of the book is vital to understanding the concept. The Leviathan is depicted as a colossal artificial man, a giant whose body is literally made up of thousands of tiny individual citizens who have agreed to the contract. This sovereign giant holds a sword in one hand, representing absolute military and police power, and a crozier in the other, representing absolute religious authority.
And Hobbes insists this power must be absolute and undivided. You cannot have checks and balances. You cannot have a separation of church and state, because the moment power is divided, factions form, the wolves come back out, and you slide right back into civil war. Only the overwhelming, terrifying power of the Leviathan can enforce the contracts that make civilization possible.
While his solution of an absolute dictatorship is highly controversial and often rejected today, we must recognize the intellectual revolution Hobbes achieved. He entirely stripped away the medieval concept of the divine right of kings. In Hobbes's model, the ruler does not get his power from God raining it down from heaven.
It comes from the people.
The ruler gets his power from a contract made by the people themselves, built from the bottom up, purely for the practical purpose of their own physical self-preservation. It is the grim, secular bedrock of modern political science.
So we've reduced humans to calculating machines, wolves, and political pawns. But the history of philosophy is a massive, multi-generational conversation. And whenever the intellectual pendulum swings too far in one direction, someone incredibly brilliant pushes back. This brings us to Section 6, the rebellion of the heart. We arrive at a philosopher who looked at Descartes' cold math and Hobbes's brutal statecraft and said, "You are missing the most profound, essential piece of the human puzzle." We are talking about Blaise Pascal.
Pascal lived from 1623 to 1662, and he was an absolute terrifying prodigy. As a teenager, he invented one of the world's first mechanical calculators to help his father with tax collection. He laid the foundational mathematics for modern probability theory. He was a master of the rational mind.
He was a logic machine.
But then, on the night of November 23, 1654, Pascal experienced something that shattered his reliance on pure logic. He had a profound, ecstatic, mystical experience. He frantically wrote a breathless note about the experience, a piece of paper known as the memorial, which he literally sewed into the lining of his coat and wore next to his heart for the rest of his life.
That night completely rewired him. He largely abandoned his scientific work and turned his massive intellect toward writing an apology or a defense of the Christian faith. He died very young before he could finish it, leaving behind a collection of brilliant fragmented thoughts that were compiled and published as the Pensées. Pascal was deeply critical of his fellow philosophers, particularly Descartes.
He really was.
He felt that Descartes' version of God was just a mechanical prime mover, a cold, abstract concept that flicked the first domino to start the universe and then completely walked away. Pascal didn't want the God of the philosophers. He wanted the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He wanted a deeply personal, felt presence.
Which brings us to his beautiful, enduring quote, "The heart has its reasons which reason knows nothing of." He is making a radical claim here. He's arguing that cold, calculating logic is not the only way to perceive reality, and in matters of ultimate meaning, it is actually the inferior tool.
He builds his argument around a framework of three incommensurable orders of reality. Can we break down what he means by incommensurable? Because it's a clunky word, but it's the key to his whole philosophy.
Incommensurable means they lack a common measure. You cannot use the tools or the rules of one order to accurately measure or judge the value of another. Pascal outlines three of these distinct orders. The first and lowest is the order of the flesh. This is the material world. It is the realm of physical strength, material wealth, and political power. It is the domain of kings, generals, and Hobbes's Leviathan.
Then moving up, the second order is the order of the mind, or reason. This is the realm of intellect, scientific discovery, and philosophical logic. This is the world of Archimedes, Descartes, and brilliant mathematicians.
And finally, the third and infinitely highest order is the order of the heart, or charity. This is the realm of faith, divine grace, and spiritual love. It is the domain of the saints.
So if we apply the concept of incommensurability to these orders, what does this actually look like in practice?
It means that a mathematical genius is not physically stronger than a king. The king's massive physical army cannot conquer or disprove a mathematical theorem. They operate on entirely different planes. And most importantly, moving to the highest level, a saint's divine charity and profound faith cannot be proven or disproven by a mathematical equation or a logical philosophical argument.
You can't math your way into faith.
Exactly. God is felt intimately by the heart, not deduced by the cold mechanics of logic. Reason is a brilliant tool, but it has strict limits. True wisdom, for Pascal, is reason knowing when it must step aside and surrender to the heart.
Pascal forces us to look at the deeply paradoxical nature of human beings. We are capable of mapping the stars and inventing mechanical calculators, yet we are constantly driven by these profound irrational passions and a desperate longing for the infinite. He brings the fullness of the human experience back into philosophy.
It is a vital corrective. We have covered an immense expanse of human thought today.
We really have. Let's take a breath and look at the incredible journey we've just been on. We started with Heraclitus, watching the waters of the river constantly change, telling us that identity is fluid. We watched Socrates force the most powerful people in Athens to admit their own ignorance. We've seen Plato drag us painfully out of the cave of illusions, and Aristotle bring us back down to earth, reminding us to practice patience and build virtue in our communities.
The ancient world laid it all out.
Then we learned from Epicurus how to cure our anxieties by pruning our desires, and from Epictetus how to forge a mind that cannot be broken by a chaotic world. We watched Occam take his razor to unnecessary metaphysical clutter. We saw Descartes find absolute certainty in his own doubting mind, and we watched Montaigne embrace the messy, fluid reality of just being human. We saw Machiavelli, More, and Hobbes wrestle with the brutal, bloody realities of power and societal design. And finally, Pascal reminded us that our hearts perceive profound truths that our brains can't even comprehend.
The vital takeaway from all of these diverse thinkers is that the value of philosophy is not in providing you with a final, comfortable, easy answer. If it were easy and comfortable, it wouldn't be philosophy, it would be dogma.
Right.
The true value is in the disruption. It is the constant, necessary act of forcing ourselves out of whatever cave we currently inhabit. These are not dead texts meant for academics. They are vital, living lenses. You can use them to interrogate your own life, your career choices, your modern anxieties, and the structure of the society you live in. Philosophy demands that we continually, relentlessly examine our own assumptions.
I couldn't agree more. And I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to chew on as you go about your day. Think about how these massive ideas layer on top of each other. If our everyday reality is constantly being shaped by our internal judgments, as Epictetus warned us, and if our perception of the world is inherently limited and easily fooled by our physical senses, as Descartes proved, and if our social structures are constantly driven by our passions and fears, as Hobbes believed, then maybe the ultimate philosophical act isn't trying to build a grand, perfect system to control it all.
Maybe it's something simpler.
Maybe the ultimate philosophical act is simply learning how to pay deep, unblinking attention to the present moment. Recognizing that the you who is observing the world right now is constantly shifting and changing, just like the water in Heraclitus' river. And perhaps paradoxically, that very fluid, changing self is the only true constant we actually have in this universe. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the shadows on the wall and keep exploring the incredible world around you.